Hello and welcome once more. It's time for us to once more dip our toes into the warm and pleasant seas of the vintage science fiction seas. Today we're looking at the work of Bob Shaw. Now, anyone who's regular to this channel will know that the only book I've read was the one that I reviewed recently, Shadow of Heaven. Unfortunately, I didn't know at the time, but this version that I've got is an abridged version, which wasn't actually very pleasant at all. Get out of here. Yes, unfortunately we had to give that one the old heave-ho. But what I then did was I did this little poll asking for people's suggestions for what I should read next. And I thought I'd put another Bob Shaw one in the mix just to see what would happen. And lo and behold, it won. So that's what we're doing today. It's this little fella, Ship of Strangers by Bob Shaw. Now, before I get to what the book's about and what I thought about it, let's take a look at this book in particular. The cover, let's have a look at the cover first. So the cover, I think, is quite splendidly retro in appearance. This actually depicts a scene quite near the beginning of the book, whereby this large mothership fires a warning shot to stop some little ships advancing any further. So yeah, a bit of action there for the cover, and predominantly red, which is very pleasant. This particular copy that I've got is from remaindered stock, so you can see that great big groove cut out of the top. When I got this book in a book haul, I was a little bit miffed at finding that groove, because pretty much all of the books I had that little chunk taken out of them. But now I quite like it. It's kind of like a love bite of sorts. It distinguishes it from its more common brethren. This actually is a very splendid copy in that if we look at this, the spine here, my camera is awful, but you can see the spine is immaculate. When I got this, I assumed that this had gone straight from the remainder stock into a vault somewhere, never to be read. So it had never been read. That's what I thought. But I've read it, obviously, and the spine is still immaculate. So whoever published this is by Ace Science Fiction. Their spine is really strong. I've never encountered anything like it. There's no creasing on there whatsoever. What else? What else is there of note? It's otherwise in very nice condition. This one is from 1979, so this is the year of my birth. I always measure books by when they occurred around my birth. But this was originally published in 1978, so this is just 1 year after. Okay, before we go any further, I'll just do one little sniffing and see what this devil smells of. I've done it before, but let's dip in again. Sometimes it changes. In you go. Ooh. Predominantly wood, obviously. But we do have a tiny sprinkling of ancient tobacco. Lovely. Delectable. Anyway, that's all that nonsense out of the way. Let's talk about the book itself. So this book all centres around a chap called Dave Surgener, who's aboard a geological survey, you bastard. A geological survey ship that's mapping the known universe. Well, specifically that of the Milky Way, our home galaxy. So this is a fairly bleak job, really. Very high paid, so it would seem. People normally only do it for a couple of years before growing tired and using the money for something else. But Dave is a lifer, I suppose you could say. So we follow him through a vast chunk, a relatively large chunk of his career aboard the ship Sarafand, which is this surveying ship. So they go to methodically working out within this kind of expanding radius. They go mapping everything they find. And most of it tends to be lifeless, airless kind of lumps of rock. There's also desert planets, various other things. But as you can imagine, occasionally they find something of note. Now, the way this book is actually structured is more of a vehicle, I suppose, for short stories. But they all centre around this chap, Dave, Surgeoner, the ship, and the onboard computer Aesop, who's a bit like the HAL from 2001, kind of almost sentient computer intelligence that runs the mothership, this exploratory ship. Dave and the crew man smaller vehicles that go around each planet, scanning it, so to speak. So I quite liked that idea of the exploration still being within the hands of humans. We've got this all-powerful, all-knowing computer within the mothership, but it's still, for some reason, up to humans to be in the driving seat of the actual scanning side of things. I suppose if they ever come across anything interesting, they get to choose what they do with it, or whatever. I'm not sure. There's a separate part of this exploration that we never see. So they deal specifically with intelligent civilizations they encounter along the way. So Dave's one is far more bleak, really. They very rarely find anything, but occasionally they do. And that's what we find within each of these kind of short segments that function as short stories in their own right. So I won't really talk too much about them. I'll talk specifically about one story, which was my favourite. But otherwise, it's fairly... If you've read any amount of science fiction, these ideas won't be anything too mind-blowing. We have a creature that can mimic anything. We have a race of people that live in time but non-linearly, so that was interesting actually, and slightly unusual. We have a bit where there's a scattering of these alien weapons on a desert planet, weapons that actually come alive and start trying to kill people. So we've got some quite interesting little tidbits, but all along the way it's also exploring Dave's relationship to his job and his life, I suppose. There's a reason why he's pursued this quite lonely existence over the past 2 decades. Another thing I really like about these older books is the human scale of things. The fact that even with this AI powering this survey ship, it's still the humans that are doing the lion's share of the menial task of scanning these various planets. The life that's lived upon this ship between the crew is also very interesting. The dynamics between the various crew members, seniority. There's not really any seniority because Aesop really is the unspoken captain of the ship. But because Dave's kind of the veteran of the ship, he's often deferred to, which is quite interesting. But also there's a lot of emphasis put on like the mess area where they have their meals. They sit down together and in the remote depths of space, they're still eating roast beef and drinking beer and whiskey and even smoking cigars. So I really like that. It reminded me a little bit of The Winged Man, A.E. Van Vogt's book about the submarine. Of course, that was more of a military bent, but yeah, there was a parallel there, I thought. The other interesting thing is this juxtaposition between Aesop, this super powerful artificial intelligence, and the crew members themselves. So interesting things going on between these two different forms of intelligence and how they butt up against each other. Yeah, that was really interesting too. Another thing that I really must acknowledge is the fact that I thought that this book was really well written. It flowed really well. It was really easy to read. It conjured really interesting images in my mind, and it wasn't too complicated. It always got straight to the point, and it moved at a really nice, pleasant speed. So it was quite different in many ways to the way Shadow of Heaven was written. I suppose a lot of that was to do with the abridged version, but still, it seemed like a different author. So this is a much later book, so 78, towards the end of the 70s. Yeah, I was really impressed, and it's made me want to read more of his books. So I'm really glad that you all voted for this one specifically. I'm going to read more Bob Shaw in the future. But the last thing I'd like to talk about is one of the segments towards the end. So if it were a short story compilation, it's the last short story. And the way things were going in this story, I mean, it gets pretty dark actually, the ideas, and quite scary. So they find themselves marooned really in another galaxy altogether. So Aesop, the all-powerful machine who never makes any mistakes, actually makes a mistake. So it's his vast intelligence that allows interstar travel to happen. They travel through a subspace, a pseudo space, and it allows them to travel beyond the speed of light and so make these vast jumps. But it can only be done because of the vast computing power of the computer. Anyway, Aesop makes a bloody mistake and they end up in the middle of nowhere. So they're in the same kind of area of the universe, but they are so far away they're never likely to be able to return back to our galaxy. So that's quite scary in itself. But what then happens within this localized little bit of space they find themselves in is really scary, because they realize that they're caught within what could be a black hole. It isn't a black hole, and it's something that, as far as I know, doesn't exist. Well, it doesn't. But they call it a dwindler. And so they find themselves in a part of space that's constantly shrinking. And so they notice that they're within a nebula. And so that kind of gives it away. There's so many stars. They're all being drawn together. And over the course of a day or so, they realize that everything's going down into a point. Everything's shrinking together. So all these stars are blue shifted. They're all moving towards them. A bloody scary idea. But anyway, it keeps going and going and going to the point where they shrink down to like the Planck level, like subatomic particle kind of level. And what then happens after that is really, really interesting, and I absolutely loved it. I'm not saying I'm not going to tell you whether they got back to Earth or not. You'll have to read it yourself. But I really, really enjoyed that. So anyway, let's keep it short and sweet. Let's give this book a rating. Now, this one certainly won't be getting the old heave-ho from me. In fact, I'm going to give it 4 stars out of 5. Yes, yeah, I'm quite happy with that. I mean, I suppose it's very difficult to give it 5 stars because I think some of the ideas and some of the kind of short stories here are nothing really that mind-blowing, to be honest. Of course, we're 40 years ahead of when this was written anyway, so some of it might be slightly simple for more jaded science fiction readers. But that said, it was still a thoroughly enjoying read, and I'm really looking forward to reading more Bob Shaw in the future. So there we are. Now, anyway, thanks for watching. I've got another poll up if you'd like to register your vote to what I read next. Got a few retro ones there and a more recent one, The Free Body Problem, that I've been hoping to read soon. So there we are. If you register your vote and I'll get reading. Anyway, thank you very much for watching and I'll see you next time. Cheerio!